thank God I was warring on the gridirons of the Midwest and not on the battlefields of Europe.
Nile Kinnick Jr., Iowa's immortal All-American.
Throughout the history of college football, few players have had as lasting of an effect on their fan base as Nile Kinnick. It's his image that's featured on the coin flip to start every game in the Big Ten Conference. And when nearly 70,000 fans gather to watch the Hawkeyes play in Iowa City, they do so in Kinnick Stadium.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Another episode of the Fifth Down Chat Show. I have a fantastic guest today. Scott Siepker is with me, and he is doing something that I am thrilled someone is finally doing. He's making a documentary on the great Nile Kinnick, University of Iowa's Heisman Trophy winner. So, Scott, welcome to the program, and how are you doing today?
Pretty good. I love talking about this, and so thank you for having me on. When we approach this documentary, I think most people like you're going to make an Iowa-centric documentary about Nile, and we didn't. We tried to make it more regional or even come at it from a national perspective. So I'm glad that you're having me on from the Windy City area.
Yeah, absolutely. He's this is a book project on the history of college football being, in my opinion, inseparable from American history and culture. And Nile Kinnick embodies that in almost a perfect way. So I'm thrilled to have you on. It's my pleasure. So your persona, I guess, if you want to call it that, is the Iowa nice guy. Who is the Iowa nice guy, and what's that about?
So about 10 years ago, the Iowa caucuses were going on in about 3 days. And one of the directors of the Kinnick Project, Paul Benedict, and I did this video called Iowa Nice. And it's just me talking to the camera, and the opening line. It's about, first off, it's about setting the misstereotypes of Iowa right, but in a satirical way. So the first line is, "So I hear you think you know something about Iowa. Bleep you." I'm not sure if I can cuss on your podcast or not.
Go ahead.
But yeah, it's just fuck you. And it's said in a very direct, dry manner. And then the rest of the video is essentially telling people to F off if they don't respect Iowa. And of course, it was all tongue in cheek, but it just, because the caucuses, we had all the national, international media here, the thing went viral. And then we ended up I wanted to kind of get away from politics, because that first video is kind of heavy on politics. This is 10 years ago now. So things were different on the political scene. But even then I was like, I don't want to do this forever. And also that persona that you're talking about, the Iowa nice guy, he is while he's a part of me, he is very different from me. He's very vulgar. He's a real jerk face, and he just insults everybody all the time. And so after that was a huge hit, we got over 1 million views on YouTube, which back then was a big deal. And I was getting interviewed on BBC and CNN and Fox and everywhere. We eventually spun that into sports, and we did Hawkeye Nice and Cyclone Nice, where we promoted both universities, and then we made fun of every school in the Big Ten and the Big 12 and Nebraska twice. And it's so easy, but it was one of those things that was like, well, if we're going to make fun of everybody for making fun of us, then we should make fun of everybody else. And so we did that, and then that led us to being on ESPN for 2 seasons doing college football comedy content, and we made fun of Nebraska every single week, and it was a blast. But that's kind of that Iowa nice guy persona. I was starting to get asked to be a public speaker. Turns out that the Iowa nice guy is not a very good public speaker, because he just gets up on the podium and just says, okay, I'll take my check now and fuck you. And then he leaves. It's like, it's not going to work. So I had to kind of modify and bring more of me out, and I'm much more animated and can carry a 45-minute speech because I want to be there, unlike that character who was just so crude, but so much fun to play. And of course, that kind of morphed because nobody really cares that it's a character. I understand that I'm synonymous with it. So people still think of me as the Iowa nice guy, and I'm just fine with it. It has definitely made my life way better.
Yeah, it's a funny character. I actually, when you were explaining the video, I was at your website yesterday, and I believe it leads the website, or the Iowa Nice website, whatever it is,
Mhm.
not your personal site. And so I tweeted that out today. So everybody, when you see this, you can check my feed. I tweeted out that video. I watched it last night and was laughing pretty hard. It's
Just
very
for the
funny.
record, not all the jokes still work. It's 10 years ago, so just beware. Things have changed.
There you go. You have your warning. Be warned before you watch it, but you'll have a laugh. So are you an Iowa alum, Iowa State? What did you have any
So
history
I grew
there?
up in really tiny town in Iowa called Mount Carmel with 101 people and 26 pets. And I grew up a Hawkeye fan. That was when Hayden Fry had turned Iowa into an actual really good program.
The
And my
legend.
parents never went to college, but like so many people in Iowa during Hayden Fry's time, became Hawkeye fans. So I was raised in a household as a Hawkeye fan, but we were very supportive of Iowa State. Like my dad went to the first game ever at Jack Trice Stadium. I think
Oh,
it was
wow.
against Air Force. So he wore both stuff, and he, neither of them. They were just blue collar workers. So they like sports. And so I eventually went to Iowa State though for college, and became a pretty big Cyclone fan while I was there. But I never lost my fandom of Iowa. So I was this weird. I'm a Scott divided, is what I like to say.
Sure.
And most people don't even believe me, but I know it's true. So really, I have always been a Hawkeye fan, and now I was in college a long time ago. We won't talk about how long, but I've been an Iowa State fan for a really long time too. But my life is made better when both programs are doing well. So thank you to Kirk Ferentz and Matt Campbell.
Yeah, it's a common story in the state of Iowa. Unlike the aforementioned Nebraska, I don't know if the Nebraskians realize how fortunate they are to have one flagship school that plays major college football in their state. Because if Iowa just had one major college football in their state, it would be a very different story, but they have two. So a house divided is a normal thing. We were talking before we started recording. I was born in Iowa City. I have a lot of connections to the state. A lot of my earliest life memories are in Iowa City, Kinnick Stadium, which is partially why I want to have you on this. This is something that's close to my life. But I have an uncle, Dave Swanson. Swanee, if you're watching this, I'm talking about you. He lives in Cyclone country, and he worked for Iowa Vet and had tailgates prior to Iowa State games. And we used to go down regularly, usually for the Iowa State game. And when I was young, those were the years when Iowa won 15 straight, and it was a really one-sided series. So had a lot of fun with Swanee over the years, talking Hawkeye, Cyclone football. It's evened up a lot over the last, 20 years.
Sort of. Well, now, but what Iowa's won, 6 straight at this
correct.
point?
Correct.
So, yeah, and this year it doesn't look like Iowa's certainly going to be favored by quite a bit coming in this game, but we've seen crazy things happen in that series, and it's a wonderful series. I do a thing here locally. The NBC affiliate for like the last 25 years has what's called RVTV. The week of the Iowa State game, they take the newscast essentially on the road and stay in different small towns every night leading up to the Iowa State game. And what's really cool about it is you see Iowa and Iowa State fans, even though it's a real rivalry,
yes,
really hanging out together. And it reminds you that Twitter is not necessarily reflective of real life, because on Twitter, it is nasty. It's uncomfortable. Like, I don't even like to engage in it. But when you're out there and you see two grandmas with both their grandkids on their lap, and they're all wearing different combinations of Iowa and Iowa State stuff, and they're getting along just fine, it's a good reminder. Like, it is a good thing that these rivalries still get played, because for the most part, they don't drive people apart. They actually bring people together. So I hope that we, even with college realignment, somehow we find a way to get back even more to the rivalries, which I think the geography is really the core of what makes college football the best.
Yeah, I would agree 100% with that. I talk about it a lot of times as being a folk game, a folk sport. Came up from the land. Universities are very much tied to place. They don't move like professional franchises, and people grow up representing and identifying with their universities in very personal ways. So when you look at the history of the sport, last year, for example, in pursuit of my project, just talk about for a second, I went to 15 games across the country last fall. I was on the road the entire fall, and they were all essentially rivalry games, historical games, because as you just said, they built the sport. So if you can go to those rivalry games and tell the story of how they came together, you're really telling the story of college football. So I would agree 100% with the way you just described it.
It just sucks. Like, even if you take it to basketball, like Kansas and Missouri don't play anymore.
Oh yeah.
Like, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's really frustrating to see that. And there's so many examples across the country, but it's just, hopefully we can get back to more somehow in all of this realignment. We'll get back to this weird place where it just makes sense to break everything down by geography again. So we'll see. Money, of course, will dictate all of this, but hopefully we'll get lucky and the romance of college football will be reintroduced.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think what you're saying is totally preposterous either. If it breaks down into kind of a super league situation where a set number of schools are competing at the top level, it very well may make sense once more to break it down into geographical regions and pit local schools, regional schools against each other. So it's not an insane dream, in my opinion. We can keep the dream alive for now.
I'm going to. That's what I'm going to do. Just keep it alive.
Good man. Good man. All right, so we're here to talk about Kinnick the documentary. It looks fantastic. There's a trailer. I'll shoot it out from my Twitter feed. I'll pop it on Instagram. You guys have got to watch it. It'll give you goosebumps. It'll give you chills. The images, the words, it's American history, it's college football history. It's a true sizzle reel kind of preview. I've been looking over some interviews you've given and talked about it. Was this really a 10-year journey from start to finish?
Yeah, from idea. So as I told you before, we had that Iowa Nice hit 10 years ago where we went viral, and then it was, okay, now what do we do? So we had a couple projects here and there, and I had this idea to try and tell a story we had access to, because I'm in Iowa, and really wanted to get away from just doing 2-minute videos, getting to doing 90-minute features, not just documentaries, but hopefully dramatizations at some point. But to try to do that transition from 2 minutes to longer, well, it turns out we weren't quite ready for that. We didn't quite have the platform for it. So that idea to do a documentary on Nile Kinnick and Jack Trice, if people aren't familiar, Jack Trice was the first African-American athlete at Iowa State, and he ended up dying in his first real college football game, as he called it, and the stadium in Ames is named for him, Jack Trice Stadium. So I wanted to do documentaries. We're going to first do them on both guys, but then once we started doing research, it was clear that both deserved their own documentary. So we split them up, and we pursued the Kinnick one to this point, to its completion, and then hopefully pick up the Trice one here in a little bit. But we didn't, for a couple of years, we tried to fundraise, failed. So it wasn't like we started working on this 10 years ago. It was the idea. The genesis was about 10 years ago. And then about 6 years ago is when we started actually filming. And that we didn't have funding to actually pay ourselves. So anytime anything else came up that would pay us, we of course had to do that. So we'd go months and months and months and months at a time without working on Kinnick. And really without the pandemic, unfortunately shutting everything down, including a lot of my client work, because I tell stories of different businesses and stuff. With all that going away, we had time. Well, if we're not getting paid, we might as well work on this creative project we're not getting paid for. So that's what we did, and we were able to get that completed. And here we are, August 24th is when we release it to the world.
Yeah, long journey. I always had it out in front of you somewhere. The COVID insight is interesting. I think a lot of projects were launched during COVID days. My project was launched during COVID days. There was something about that time that sort of spoke to you. If you were going to do something, now's a great time to do it, to put the nose to the grindstone and get to work. So that's very interesting to me. To move into Nile Kinnick himself, Kinnick, he aid Iowa, another small town in Iowa, primary school there, high school there. He finishes high school in Omaha, Nebraska, before going back to Iowa, which makes him just one more player. Nebraska lost to the University of Iowa. Um, I've heard different stories about why Kinnick picked Iowa. Did you hear a story? And if so, what did it say about Kinnick, the young man?
Yeah, there's not a ton of information. So what we did is that we use a lot of the letters. They wrote a lot of letters and he kept a lot of letters, but back then it was like, it was like currency. So not every letter was kept. The vast majority of them are not kept. They're destroyed or lost to time in some way. The best that we can piece it together is that Nile was interested in a couple places. And mostly at that time, it was the University of Minnesota. They were the powerhouse at the time, along with Notre Dame in the Midwest, and they had won a couple national titles. And so Nile would have wanted to go to Minnesota, but the coach there decided that, or told Nile he just wasn't big enough. And Nile at the time, he's 5'7", 170 pounds, like the size of Conor McGregor, which seems small now, but back then wasn't that small. But still, for Minnesota, an established program, wasn't fitting the bill. And
Right.
So he had some other options. His dad was the quarterback at Iowa State, so he had a connection there. His mother had gone to Drake University and then a little later went to Northwestern for studying voice. So he had connections to those places, but Iowa was kind of the leader in the clubhouse, and they were so awful. They were awful. They had only won a couple games in a couple years total. And Nile went there knowing that, well, this is a bad program, but maybe I can help turn it around. So he did. And freshmen at that time couldn't play. So his sophomore year, they were awful. His junior year, they were awful. And then luckily, it all came together his senior year.
Yeah, we're going to get into that senior season, the fabled 1939 season in Iowa City. The end of what you were talking about with Kinnick there is kind of the part of the story that I'd latched onto in using Kinnick as an inspirational figure, which is Iowa had been bad. Kinnick saw an opportunity to make them better. When you look at Kinnick, the young man and the man, he's sort of, well, I want to get into his family and how his family might have influenced his attitude. He had a grandfather, George Clark, who was a two-term governor of Iowa during the World War I years. You just said his dad was Nile Kinnick Sr., who was a quarterback at Iowa State University. What roles do you think the grandfather and the father played in Kinnick's life in terms of instilling this idea of make yourself better, make the world better?
Everything. And Francis, his mother, I mean, the whole family was pushed to have curious minds and to think worldly. That was instilled from them from the beginning. And I mean, that's what they sat around and talked about: world events and national events. Academics were very important to them. Reading was very important. And that was from the top down, from Governor Clark throughout. And so that's what they did. They just would sit around and talk about these things, reading the newspaper and doing. So Nile, from a very early age, was instilled with a very wide perspective. And at the time, Nile was born during World War I, at the end of World War I, and then he lived through the Great Depression. The world events were your events at that time. I mean, it was not an easy time to grow up, and so they didn't have a ton of money. The Kinnicks didn't, even though they had Grandpa Clark was former governor. Nobody had a lot of money back then in that area of Adel, and so they had that wonderful extended family, and they relied on each other all the time, and you can see that play out throughout all of Nile's views.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I went to school at UCLA, and they had a coach out there named John Wooden. And John Wooden was known for reciting poetry essentially until the day of his death. He had verse memorized. If you watch Scott's preview of the movie, you'll hear a poem called Excelsior mentioned. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He was a 19th century romantic poet. Excelsior is kind of a poem about endeavoring on in the face of difficulty, never losing sight of your ideals. I don't want to give away what's in the documentary about it, but was that some kind of, was verse and literature an essential part of the Kinnick's life? Was that an important exchange, or was that just something that happened one day?
So one thing that to keep in mind when you see the documentary, and something we had to keep in mind as filmmakers, is that usually a letter was not saved on accident because there were so many of them. And so if a letter was kept specifically for a very long time, then that probably held some importance to Nile or to one of the members of the family. And so that poem that Governor Clark had kind of rewritten, he wrote most of it, but he gave Longfellow all the credit, but he did change a few lines here and there as he was writing to Nile upon his graduation. And that poem, Excelsior, originally in the first cut of the film, which was over 2 hours, I think we had it in there like little bits and pieces of it like 7 times. And then as we got reviews, people thought it was a little too long, so we trimmed it down to 90 minutes. And the poem is still there. And I think Excelsior, if it is not the singular theme, I want people to put in whatever theme they want as they watch it. But I think you could definitely make the observation that Excelsior itself is a theme, if not the theme of the film. And so we just had that kind of permeate throughout the film. And even though we've taken out in most spots, it's still there kind of as a guide rail for the film. And so, you'll hear that. And the voice actor who reads that, his name is John Busby, and he has this very low bassy voice that I think will be memorable as well.
Yeah, it's really great. I love it as a theme. I like to hear that runs through the piece. I think people really like that. Another fascinating element of this that I picked up from the preview and some of the interviews is you were able to connect with Don Bice. Is that how you say his name? Don Bice?
Yes, Don Bice, yeah.
Nile's first cousin. He's apparently in his 90s. He looks spectacular.
He's 95 now. His wife is 92. They just celebrated their 70th wedding anniversary. And Don grew up in Adel. He's with Nile. George was Nile's youngest brother, 8 years younger than Nile. And so Don is 8 years younger as well. Sure. And so they would just like practice with Nile. I mean, like, this is the man who was able to really unlock our documentary because it gave us that firsthand approach that we just didn't think we'd find anymore. And somehow no one has ever interviewed Don before.
That's amazing.
I don't know how that happened.
I can't believe that.
Yes, but he's able to give insight to Nile and bring him alive in a way that nobody else on earth possibly can. So we're very fortunate to have Don give us all of his memories, and Anne as well. She wasn't there. Obviously, she met Don later in life, but has had to listen to Don talk about Nile for 70 years, because you can hear, even though now Don is in his 90s, the admiration, it permeates out of Don. And probably when you see the film, you'll probably with the way that Don talks about Nile, you might just be drawn to tears, because you can just see and hear and feel the love that he still has for his first cousin.
Yeah, that's really amazing. Whatever you believe in or don't believe in, God, the great magnet, luck, whatever it is, the fact that Don Bice was there for you to capture for this documentary at 95 years old is one of the most incredible things I've ever heard.
And he looks great. When you see him in the trailer, you'll be like, there's no way that guy's in his 90s. He is.
It's amazing. He was walking around in front of their house. I was looking at this guy and I thought, wow, like, he's 70 years old. He doesn't look old enough to have known. Now 95. I couldn't believe it. Yeah. It's spectacular genetics.
And taking care of yourself. Don and Ann both take very good care of themselves.
Okay, that's great. You were answering a bunch of my questions. That was a fantastic answer, but that's kind of what I wanted to know. There are a lot of different ways to try to get historical figures, and generally you're not fortunate enough to know someone who knew the person. And when you do, you can start to get a feel for what they were like in a room, what they were like to be around, all the details that are missed, and even the best biographies. So you mentioned some of it, the admiration he had. Did he, you said unlock the documentary, did he give you anything about what Nile was like to be around in person as a person?
Yes, I mean and you have to put it into context. He was 8 years younger than Nile,
Sure.
and so of course he looked up to him. And the way he talks about Nile is still like in that kid mindset, even for a man in his 90s. So there's that wonder, and I think that that tells you a lot. Just in that even after all of these years, all the things that Don has seen, he never lost the wonder for Nile. And the presence that Don kind of describes is just Nile. He, even though he was 5'7", 5'8", he had this presence about him and this calm. And a lot of that comes, as Don describes, from his mother and from his father. They're just solid people, and that instilled into Nile. And Nile eventually became one of the most famous people in America, which sounds crazy, but in 1939 that actually happened. And even through his wartime, he never lost that humbleness. And that's something that comes through too. Like when Don talks about his practicing with Nile punting balls to him or throwing balls to him, like it was never condescending. It was never like, "Oh, you little twerps, you're in my way." He was always so thankful that he had little rugrats to go fetch his balls for him, or just
Sure.
help him, run around and do all those sorts of things. So, yeah, I think Don just verifies that Nile was a genuinely good person.
I think people are going to absolutely love that part of the documentary. Well said. And you mentioned the football, which we have to, when we're talking about Nile Kinnick, we at least have to talk a little bit about the football. He always made sure people knew that he felt football was a fun pastime, a good time. I think Kinnick saw it as a way to teach yourself to overcome difficulty. He loved being part of a team, but he always made sure people knew it was just a part of his life. But in everything he ever said, I get the sense that he loved football too. Did you get the feeling Nile loved the game of football, loved to play it, or not?
Yes. And just competition in general, sports in general. Like when he went to Iowa, he wasn't just playing football. He was also playing basketball and baseball. And then he eventually dropped those periodically over the next couple of years. But he just loved sports. I mean, and you think growing up in the Great Depression, it's not like they had a lot of toys or anything. So what were they doing? They were out playing sports as much as they possibly could. And he just loved that competition. But to your point, it was never going to be his whole life. And so when he had the opportunity to go to the NFL, he turned those opportunities down because he had done it. He had accomplished what he wanted to on the football field. And now it was time to start shifting. And he was going to go into the law and probably get into politics like his grandfather. So the thing about the Kinnick household, you were never going to be in an environment that supported or pushed you to focus on one thing. You were going to be pushed into it. You were in an environment that really rewarded and amplified that you should be well-rounded as a human being. And in Niall's case, as a gentleman, and that's what he did. He was very worldly, even when he was a young man.
Yeah, they very much seem like kind of a Renaissance family, a classical family. It seems like it would have been a fantastic way to grow up. Clearly molded some good people. Yeah, I'm going to circle back on the NFL choice after the 39 season in just a minute. So the 39 season, that Iowa team is known as the Iron Men. Famously, Tennessee's great coach General Robert Nealon called anything not Iron Man chicken shit football when they were approving the substitution rules in the late 50s and 60s. So Iowa had essentially an Iron Man team in 1939. 11 guys went out on offense. Same 11 guys stayed out on defense. They had a fantastic season. What to you stuck out about that 39 season, both for the Hawkeyes as a program and for Kinnick as the guy who would go on to win the 5th ever Heisman Trophy?
Yeah, this was really unexpected. They, as I had said before, they were a bad football team for many years. But Nile was clearly the leader. Even though he was on bad teams his sophomore and junior year, he was getting nationally recognized. And So when they came into the 39 season, they had just gotten a brand new coach in, and he was a Notre Dame man, and that was Dr. Eddie Anderson. And when Dr. Eddie Anderson was playing with the Gipper at Notre Dame in the 1921 season, Notre Dame only lost one game that year, and that was to the 1921 Hawkeyes. And Duke Slater was on that team. Duke was just elected to the Pro Football Hall of Fame last year. Finally, he was one of the great linemen of his generation, but as a black man was not given the same opportunities to succeed, and so then that's why it took so long for him to get recognized just now as into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. But he went on to have an amazing career in Chicago as an attorney and eventually a judge. But Eddie Anderson comes in and he changes the way they're doing things. He runs these guys incessantly. He wants them to be the roughest, toughest that you can possibly be. And guys just start quitting in the spring. They just start quitting because he's running them so hard. And so that means the people who are left were really well conditioned and really wanted to be there. And they also had Nile Kinnick, which turned out he was the best player that year. So it's always good to have the best player in the country. And so they started off that year and they won. They won a couple games, and then they had to play Notre Dame, and everyone, they're not going to beat the Notre Dame. And they beat Notre Dame. And then they go on and they beat Minnesota at the time. It's a school that didn't want to have Nile. And they go on and have this seemingly miraculous season. But when you look at it from the details, like, they were purposeful in the way that they achieved these things. And it caught everybody off guard. And at that time in the Great Depression, like, this type of story was the thing that people could relate to, because almost everybody, specifically in the Midwest, was having such a hard time that to have the underdog actually get up there and beat the top dogs, Minnesota and Notre Dame, was just was a story that caught wildfire. And then Nile ended up, because he performed so well, won the Heisman Trophy that year.
Yeah, what should we call that? The Seabiscuit syndrome of the Depression era, or the underdog story? You basically answered. I was gonna ask that. Was part of the memorable nature that this season seemed to come out of nowhere. Iowa had been so bad for so many years, and then all of a sudden they not only have one of the best teams in the country, they got the best player in the country right there in Iowa City.
Yeah, that's exactly. It just came out of nowhere, and people could just relate to this blue collar way, where bigger programs like Minnesota and Notre Dame had enough talented players that they could have a lot of players on the field playing. Well, Iowa didn't have that. So that's why they only had 11, 12, 13, 14 players play in a game. That's total.
Right.
And so by the end of the season, you saw that wear them down, as you would suspect it would. But you could just relate to these people this team who just didn't have as much as others, but still winning games however they could find a way to do. And so that was inspirational to the time. I mean, really, it's inspirational to any time, but specific to the Great Depression. I think a lot of us in modern times really forget, or really have no idea, can't even relate to how bad it was financially during the Great Depression. And so the Iron Men of that 1939 team just captured the imagination of the American people.
Yeah, well said. And for those of you listening and watching this, when it posts, look up Dr. Eddie Anderson. I may mention him one more time. He's another fascinating character in college football history. He was Iowa's coach at this time, as Scott said. Take a look at Dr. Eddie Anderson. So 1939, we've talked about the Heisman Trophy. Kinnick won a lot more than that. Just a quick list of the awards. He won the Big Ten MVP. That's the Chicago Tribune's Silver Football by the largest margin ever. He won the Maxwell Award, the Walter Camp Award. And I think the one that probably put him on another level nationally was when he also won the Associated Press Male Athlete of the Year, which that's all athletes. So you talk about Joe Louis, Joe DiMaggio, Byron Nelson, the golfer, all these guys were up for it that year. Nile Kinnick wins. So I don't know if that shot him up or it just reflected how famous he'd become. but he wasn't just a well-known in Iowa. This was a big American name.
Yes, winning all those awards gave credence to his popularity and to his skill. And then when he gave that Heisman speech, which is still considered the greatest Heisman speech of all time, that just catapulted him. People saw he wasn't just some dumb jock. You know, he's a well-spoken, obviously he's good looking too. That never hurts. But he was the best college football player that year. Yeah, and to beat Joe Louis, who I think had 4 knockouts that year as the heavyweight champion, and Joe DiMaggio, who hit some astronomical batting average that year, to have Nile win that award, Athlete of the Year, it's really incredible. It's absolutely incredible to think, especially back then, when you think about how big a deal baseball and boxing were.
Yeah.
It's hard for us now in 2022 to even understand how big a deal. You think about how big the NFL was. That's how big baseball and boxing was back then. And maybe you could even argue bigger than that.
Yeah.
Because we didn't have as many entertainment options. And so for Nile Kinnick, this little guy from Adel, Iowa, to win all these awards, he was somebody people wanted to be around, and that just made him so famous at the time.
Yeah. I talked about the folk game a little earlier, kind of made him a folk hero. Like you said, the Heisman speech, which they play before games at Kinnick Stadium now. Your preview showed the Big Ten ceremonial coin, which are very rare. You can't just go buy one of these somewhere, that they flip before the game, as Nile Kinnick as the head side of the coin. The Heisman speech was one other thing I was going to make. You mentioned the famous Heisman speech. You talked about the worldly nature of the Kinnick family and how they were always looking outward, even though they were small town Iowa. What was it about that speech you think that makes it resonate so deeply into history as it is now? And what was so important about that speech, so fascinating about it?
That's one of the things I'm most proud about in this documentary is we really break down that speech. We take the time in the film to break down what he meant, because most of us don't know what he's talking about. It's kind of a thing that we understand. We recognize the rhythm, and it's so familiar to us now that it makes us go rah, rah, rah. And that's not necessarily, it wasn't really a rah, rah speech. So
right.
It really, I won't get into it too much, but the way, what he was trying to do there was he went against what he was supposed to do. He was supposed to just get up there, thank his teammates and his coaches, say thank you, and sit down. But instead, he made essentially a political statement. And now when we hear, stick to sports, that was not something Nile Kinnick did. And you see that when he's talking, he's standing, like he's talking to some of the most powerful and rich people in the country at a time where the country is trying to decide whether or not it should get into a second world war. The cojones to do that is incredible. And that back then, when he said those words, of course, people understood that a lot more than we do presently, because the croix de guerre is not something that most Americans don't know what that is. Heck, I didn't know exactly what it was until we really dug into this.
Right.
But at the time, people would have known what that was.
Sure. And
so as you listen to that speech and you feel those goosebumps, you're not exactly sure. I think even though you don't know exactly what he's saying, the fact that you can still feel it, and you're like, there is something badass about what just happened. And that you can feel that without even really understanding what he's saying, tells you how powerful of a moment that was. Yeah,
absolutely. Everybody, if you have one reason to tune in for this documentary, that may be it. It's a powerful little piece of history, and it's worth knowing about. So I'm looking forward to that moment, especially. So to hop back to football here for a moment, Nile really has about one big game left, if you want to call it a big game. A guy named Arch Ward right over here in the Tribune Tower invented something in 1933 called the college pro football all-star game. You talk about looking back from our time to theirs. You want to talk about something you can't believe actually happened. They assembled a group of graduating college seniors, the best in the country, and they pitted them against the NFL champions at Soldier Field up the street over here. And they played a real football game. And go and look at that history, because there's a lot of history. I don't want to go through the whole thing, but it's an extremely interesting period in football history in this country. But what I want to talk about here is, for those people who thought Nile Kinnick was maybe a Midwestern phenomenon, maybe a good little player at Iowa who had a nice season, but really wasn't much of a football player. I don't know if you get into this in your doc, but do you talk about what happened at that college all-star game with Kinnick kind of starring for the team?
Yeah, we mentioned it, and still great uniform. So Google
Sure.
it. I mean, it's really cool to see that those uniforms. But yeah, we get into it. Now we don't have to spoil too much, but let's just say Nile was pretty good that game. Pretty good that game.
He was pretty good. You'll have any lingering questions about his talent as an athlete answered. So I'm glad you got into that, because I love that little piece of the story, because there's always that question. At this time, Nile won the 5th ever Heisman Trophy. Okay, the first 5 Heisman Trophy winners, the first 4 before him, a couple of them played about, as they say in Major League Baseball, had a cup of coffee in professional football and decided it just wasn't for them. It wasn't a glamorous game. College was the far more glamorous game. It didn't pay well. And they took other careers, teaching, in the FBI. We're talking big names. We're talking Davey O'Brien. We're talking about the 2 Yale players who won it back-to-back. Jay Berwanger, the first winner. These were big names, and they didn't touch professional football. So there was always that lingering question of, were these guys just good college players, or could they have competed with the best had they gone on to the early years of professional football? So I'm glad you got into that. This leads into the next phase. So as you said, you know what, let me step back 1 second here. It's a little more interesting that Kinnick turned down the NFL, because there had really been one person in pro football in 1939 who ever made any real money, and it was Red Grange. And he was a complete phenomenon. He set the country on fire with pro football for just a few years, and the game faded back. Kinnick was being offered kind of a Red Grange-like package to play pro ball, but he turns it down, and he goes into law school at the University of Iowa, and he's going to do a little coaching on the side. So we talked about the Kinnick family, the Kinnick mindset. What is at work there that Kinnick turns down pro football and heads back to school to get into law? What do you think's happening there?
He's just moved on. I mean, he knows what he's accomplished is great, and it's not to say it wasn't valuable. It certainly was, but Nile had a diverse amount of interests, and I think at this moment it was time for him to start moving towards that next phase in life, which, of course, we don't know exactly what that would have been, but it seems pretty clear that it would have involved being in the law for a while and finding a way into politics and becoming a public servant in that way.
Yeah, in the family line there with his grandfather. So we're getting into 1940. World War II has started in Europe. Kinnick enlists in the Reserve Navy. What's going on with Kinnick there as he enlists in the Reserve Navy?
So the myth out there is that when Nile heard about Pearl Harbor, he ran to the enlistment office and volunteered immediately. That is not any way true. And so we get into, this is one of the things I'm really proud of in the film, is I've never seen this done before. We really break down that decision, and we go back to his actual words and the letters back and forth between him and his family, him and his buddy who he wants to volunteer with so that they can get put into the same onto the same base. And so this is a very deliberate decision that really got started many months earlier. And I'm excited for people to see that, and us to really, I think that's one of the ways that we really peel back the myth, the legend, and show like, okay, he wasn't just like he just had a moment of like, they attacked Pearl Harbor, I will defend Old Glory, and then run
Right.
down like it's some sort of no. Nile Kinnick was not somebody who did things very often, if ever, on a whim. He was a man who was deliberate and tried to make intelligent decisions. And this is one of the reasons why he was so good at anything that he did. And so that whole enlistment process and that enlistment section in our film is one that I'm really, really proud of.
I'm looking forward to that. It's a period that there's not a ton of information about, so I'm looking forward to see what you have. I don't know if people know this about that time, but people did enlist in the reserves like that. My grandfather on my father's side, who I never met, enlisted in the Army reserves in about 1949, 48, 49. If there's any military historians out there, his name was Glenn Schipper. What we understand, and he was the youngest captain in the history of the Iowa Army reserves, which were kind of like the National Guard. So Kinnick doing that was actually, it was of a piece with his outlook on national life, on being a good citizen of a country, but it was also of the era. People were doing that at the time. Was that part of, did you find that?
Yeah, you had a choice. If you're a young man, you knew you're probably going to the war one way or the other. So what you could do is get drafted, which was 2 years of service, and roughly at least 2 years of service. And then when the war's over, if the war gets over, you're out, you're done. But if you enlist, that's a 4-year commitment. And if the war is over, you still have to fill out those 4 years. But if you enlist, then you get to pick branch of service. And so these are the things that all young men back then were deciding. Do I want to take my chances of not getting drafted? Or do I just want to stay in control of this and pick what branch of service I want to be in? That was the decision at the time. And that's what Nile was wrestling with. What should he do?
Yes. So he chose the Navy. I'm guessing he wanted to be a pilot from the beginning. In your preview, you show some notebooks that apparently were discovered. Were those notebooks known before you went to work on this, or did you guys discover these Kinnick notebooks that apparently he kept while he was training to be a pilot?
Yeah, these are his 3 war journals, and they've been in the archives at the University of Iowa for as long as I know. And so, yeah, you can just go there if you want to, you can check them out. Of course, somebody will watch you and make sure you're not doing anything, but yeah, you can see it. And it was really to hold those notebooks, to look at that writing, know that that is his penmanship, and that at some point he has a whole gambit of emotions in those journals. And when he's really low, because sometimes he's not doing so well in his pilot training, and other times he's really excited about things, and he's waxing poetic about various things. In those war journals, he essentially predicts the Cold War. He writes about the Soviet problem, and he writes about race relations, and he's just an incredible mind. And yeah, those diaries really give you the most close-up look into the mind of Nile Kinnick.
To read his writing.
He wrote in the diary, said it's just like paradise, flying in and out of those clouds.
I think he could have been anything, maybe even President of the United States.
I can speak confidently and positively that the players of this country would much rather struggle and fight to win the Heisman Award than croix de guerre. Thank you.
Yeah, that was one of those moments in your preview where I got goosebumps when I saw the penmanship in the notebooks, and thinking you can get that close to what he was thinking during his war service. For those who may not know, he was put on the USS Lexington. It would become a legendary United States aircraft carrier during World War II. He was flying F-4F Wildcats, not the slightly better F-6F Hellcat, which came shortly thereafter, which may have made a difference for him. this part of the story is known, so say whatever you feel comfortable saying. I don't want to give away anything in your documentary. He's on an aircraft carrier. They're in the Caribbean. What happens with Nile in his final days before he was going to head over to the Pacific and fight for the country?
Yeah, and this is one of those things. Maybe we'll come back on after you've seen the film, and we can
Sure.
discuss this stuff more thoroughly. But yeah, he went up for a test flight and had mechanical failure, and landed in the ocean, calm waters, and it still fully doesn't make sense to me what happened. We don't know, but by the time the rescue boats had gotten there, Nile and the plane were gone. It just, so much of it doesn't make sense, that it's quite frustrating. He was off the coast of Venezuela at the time, and just to lose him in such a, to not have the answers, it's frustrating, certainly, because it feels like he deserves better. But you know, it's just the tragedy of it all. And you wonder, losing Nile was a real loss. I think you can argue it's a real loss for the country and what he could have become. And so it's just sad. It's really sad. It's genuinely sad, even all these years later, to think about it. The fact that he was lost because of an engine failure is just, it feels like an unsuiting ending to an incredible human being.
Yeah, it really does. I don't know if it's humbling or if it's frightening or what it is, but just to know that it's that fragile, that someone of that stature at that level, and someone who just made a point of doing things the right way. You can imagine him learning to being a pilot, being absolutely meticulous in his training and learning to fly his aircraft and for every contingency. And the idea that on just a routine training flight, it could just end like that it is just sad. It's like it's a gut punch every time you get to that moment. And here we are all these years later, talking about the man. One thing that stuck out to me as I was moving through the post after his life and Iowa's football program, and in 1972, Iowa renames Iowa Stadium Kinnick Stadium. Some of my first memories in life, I don't even know exactly what year it is, sometime in the late 80s. I'm so young. All I can remember is Kinnick Stadium, being up high on the home field sideline, looking down. My dad and my uncle are there. They're saying, look for the bumblebees, look for the bumblebees. That was Iowa, the black and the gold. I can remember that. I don't know what year it is. I don't know who they were playing. I can look at the scoreboard. I remember seeing like 45 minutes on the scoreboard and asking if that really meant 45 minutes, which at whatever age I was, 45 minutes was like 5 days. It was like, I have to watch that whole thing tick down before this game starts. So Kinnick Stadium, very important to me. You know, when I found out Kinnick's father was at the dedication to the stadium to his son, I found that very moving. Do you guys get into that dedication ceremony at all? Does your documentary touch on that?
So when I was telling you we had that 2-hour version, that last 25 minutes was about the stadium renaming,
Okay,
and why it happened and all of that. And so the feedback we got from people who had screened it was, it's a really cool story, and we worked our asses off on that thing. Was that it was a cool story, but we get away from Nile for too long.
okay.
And it feels like it's its own documentary.
Okay.
And so we ended up cutting that fully out. We will find a way to repurpose that possibly into like a Duke Slater documentary, because there was a movement to have it be Kinnick Slater.
Yep.
So Duke comes into the story at that time. So I would love to do a full documentary on Duke Slater. Hopefully that happens, and we can make sure that that stadium story gets in there. But yeah, it was a process to get that renamed, and the Kinnick family originally was not supportive. Once Nile died, there was like an immediate push to have it be Kinnick Stadium, but the family was like, no, we think that you should, if you're going to rename it, name it for everyone who has lost their life in the war. And so then it went away for decades and decades and decades until the 70s, when it finally got changed from Iowa Stadium to Kinnick Stadium. But it's a really, really interesting story. And we are legitimately the only people who have, let me just stay here. I'll show. Get in my closet here. right here. Right here.
Oh boy,
These are
what is
all
this?
the letters. These are the only letters, the hard copies of the letters that tell the story of the stadium renaming. And
oh wow.
these are the only ones. And of course, we have the digital copy. We scan these because they had never gotten scanned before. And so we have those under lock and key digitally. But
What a
hopefully we
little
get
pot
to
of
tell that
gold.
story. But yeah, this is incredible find. It really is. This is a treasure trove right here. That is this, says Kinnick Stadium right here. Nobody has this but us. So hopefully
Love
we get
it.
that told at some point. But I haven't dug those out for a while. But yep, glad I knew where they were.
I love it. I really hope you get that made. I'll be first in line for that one as well. That's a great story. I found that really interesting that his family said no. That sounds like the Kinnick family. Name it for everyone. And that was, of course, a major tradition in college football. The big stadium boom in college football was in the 20s. Many were built afterwards, but the big first boom was the 1920s. And most of them were called Memorial Stadium after the veterans of World War I. Later on, they generally were rededicated to veterans of all wars, but it started as memorial stadiums to veterans of World War I. So it would have made sense for Iowa also to do a memorial stadium this time for now World War I and World War II. So very, very in line with the Kinnick family.
And
sounds
when
like
1939 happened, the stadium was in financial trouble because they weren't getting anybody to go there.
oh
And
sure.
so the 1939 was not only important for the history of the program, but for the viability of what would become Kinnick Stadium.
Yeah, very interesting. So Scott, to wrap up here, we've talked about it this whole time, but we're in 2022, and here comes a fresh documentary on Nile Kinnick, the best one yet, it appears. Why does Nile Kinnick endure? Why does he still mean something to us as Americans, to our culture, to college football? What is it about Nile Kinnick?
Well, I hope that question is answered in 90 minutes, the 90-minute film. But
Yes.
I think it is because of the person that he was, and he overcame a lot, and he also did not have a Disneyified life. I think a lot of people think when you think of like a good old boy, all-American, good-looking chap, you think kind of like everything just kind of works out, but that's not how Nile's life worked. And even through all the adversity, he always remained a good person and thought of others and looked forward. He had a positivity about him. And I think that those morals and ethics are something that still we want to go after. We want to be like Nile, even if we don't think about it in those terms. And so I think what he stands for, especially once you strip away the legend and you actually see he's just a regular guy with some really great athleticism, okay?
Right.
But he worked really hard. You and I can do that. He treated people with respect. You and I can do that. He was a loving person. You and I can do that. The things outside of, maybe scoring a lot of touchdowns on the college football field, the things that he stood for and did, we can do. And I think that ultimately that packaged into an amazingly talented football player who saw himself first as a student and not a football player, which is why the stadium statue that is up there is him carrying some books and a helmet, not him in a football gear. So I think that's really why. And we just also have nostalgia for back in the day when guys had to play both ways, I think.
Sure, definitely. Well said. Yeah, on the optimism, and I find his optimism and his belief in the future and his belief that people can do it themselves to be distinctly American in nature. I find him to be almost a throwback American character to like the mythical founding values of the country, but in a realistic way. Just someone who believed that hard work and doing it the right way and building a thing piece by piece was the way forward, and that it could indeed work. I just find him to be very American. So
yeah, he's and certainly a patriotic person through and through.
Yeah. So that's why we're talking today, Scott. I truly enjoyed the conversation. It's a subject that I love and am fascinated by. I'm thrilled you made this documentary. I cannot wait to watch it. I will be amongst the first group in line where it is to be had. So why don't you tell us right now, what date does it come out and where do we go to get it?
Yeah, August 24th. It's gonna be available on Vimeo on demand, which you'll be able to stream through your Chromecast or whatever you stream to your television. And it's on a lot of smart TVs too. I know it's a little unorthodox to be on Vimeo, but as independent filmmakers, it's our best option, and really appreciate any support people will give us by watching it. If you love it, please share it. I think you're gonna like it. I really do. I've had plenty of people who don't know Nile Kinnick, don't know what a first down is in football, and they watch this film and they're laughing and they're crying, and it's a story that will resonate, I think, and it won't be exactly what you think it's going to be. So I appreciate you having me on, Mark, and Vimeo, August 24th, anytime after.
You bet, Scott. No, it will give you a zest for life. No Vimeo excuses. Everybody knows what Vimeo is. Get out there and support Scott, support this documentary. I promise you that if you watch a documentary, Scott's documentary on Nile Kinnick, you will walk away feeling like you want to do something good for the world, which is a good thing. So Scott, thank you for being here. And I look forward to connecting with you down the road as well.
Yeah, let's do it. We can talk about the film itself, break it down if you want to in the future.
Let's do it. Absolutely.
All right. Thanks.
Take care, Scott.